Hello and welcome to the second part of this video series where we're looking at building a three-legged mech out of various pieces of junk, primarily some cupboard door hinges and various other pieces. In this video I'm going to look at sculpting up an additional piece for the model, adding some additional detail and finally painting the piece. So let's get started. I quite like the way the original sculpture I made for the front of the mech came out, so I wanted to add a few additional bits, and I thought maybe a lion on top of the head would be a good thing to do. So I'm sculpting up the piece here on the same size dome that I used for the main robot, and I've included the visor piece underneath just so I can get the shape correct. I've got a variety of different sized ball bearings to use for eyes for this one, so I think they're looking pretty good. And I'm just smoothing down the sculpture using a paintbrush and some white spirit. So in order to mould the sculpture on the front piece of this, what I'm doing is building an enclosure out of cardboard around the sculpture. So rather than pouring a load of silicone over the front of the sculpture and just letting it set, what I'm going to do is slowly rotate the sculpture around and get the silicone to flow over it and cover it. Once that's dry and I've got a layer of sufficient thickness, I'm then going to put a hard case over it. So this is a bit of a slow, laborious process. I've over-catalysed the silicone slightly so it will cure a bit quicker. Nevertheless, it always takes quite a long time, I think, particularly if the temperature in the workshop's quite low as it is at the minute. But nevertheless, after a while this sets, so what I'm now doing is adding some fiberglass onto the front of it to create a hard case to hold the mould in shape. So as with my previous Cthulhu armor costume piece that I made a few months ago, I'm going to cold cast these pieces. So what that involves is to mix some metal powder, brass powder in this case, into the resin, and then you just pour that into the mould. Once you polish this up, you get a nice natural metallic finish. So I won't actually need to paint this, it should have a nice metallic finish all of its own. Now what I'm doing is to be particularly careful to get a smooth layer on the inside of the mould. Because this has got to fit on the curved surface of the mech, I need to make sure that it's not too thick on the back so that it sits easily on the front. Now this resin sets quite quickly, but you do have a little bit of time to play with it, so I'm just using a wooden spatula to smooth it out and make sure that everything's of an even thickness. The resin's starting to go off now, so what I can now do is use a scalpel just to scrape away some of the resin that's gone over the edge. So I'm just trying to create as smooth a edge to this as possible so that it fits onto the mech as well as it can. Now for the lion, what I need to do is to cast this onto the curved surface of the dome so that it fits on the robot as well. So what I'm doing is to brush some Vaseline onto the dome and that will stop the resin sticking to it when I pour it in. So I'm just slowly easing that off, it's slowly coming away. So there we go, that needs a bit of trimming up, but it doesn't look too bad. So there we go, it's always a bit interesting to see the actual cast versus the original sculpture. The original sculpture was made of lots of found objects sort of embedded in monster clay, so because they're all different colours it did look a bit mismatched, but now that everything's cast up in the same colour I think that sort of looks much more like a cohesive piece. So quite pleased with that. So once again I just need to trim up the edges and then make sure that this actually fits on the front of the mech. Now, as I mentioned, this is comprised of cold cast resin, so there's metal powder embedded in the resin, and what I'll be doing in a bit is to actually polish this up and give it a bit of a sand with some wire wool to reveal the metal. But if I just scratch the edge here with the scalpel, as you can see there's quite a nice shine coming through from below, so I think that's going to look quite nice once I've got this all polished up. Now, I mentioned in the previous video that I wasn't too happy with what I came up with for the feet of the mech. I think these just look way too big. And actually, if you think about it, if you've got a robot with 3 legs, then it's got a much more balance than a 2-legged robot would have. So I actually think large feet probably aren't as necessary for a 3-legged mech. So what I've done is to actually use just one of the cast pieces I came up with for this. And I think that actually looks a little bit better. So I've just attached some additional cast pieces on here to serve as a sort of an ankle, and they can screw onto the bottom of the hinges like this. So there's a mech with the sculptures in place, the feet I'm going to use, the gun turrets as well. I think that's looking pretty good, so I can now, I think, start actually attaching all this stuff together. So far everything's just been blue tacked in place so that I can move it about, but I'm happy with how that's looking now, so I think now's time to actually get the super glue out and start attaching everything together. So for the main sculpture here, I didn't want to use super glue for this. I wanted to have a bit of time so that I could actually reposition it slowly before the glue dried, just so I could get the alignment right. Super glue tends to go off straight away, so that can be a bit of a problem if you get the alignment wrong. So what I'm going to do here is use hot glue, and I've turned the glue gun down slightly. Mine's got a temperature gauge on it, and what I didn't want to do is put hot glue on this and then have this melt the plastic on the front of the mech. That would be a bit of a disaster. So I turned the temperature down, and I'm just gluing that on the front. So now for the guns on the side, it's very easy to get these things misaligned, so I've measured quite carefully from the front and the back of the mech to make sure that I've got these things aligned correctly. Now when you're attaching all these disparate elements together, particularly when you're using curved surfaces, you're often going to get some gaps. So that's exactly what I've got here. So what I'm going to do is to fill in these gaps using milliput, which is a 2-part epoxy. What I'm also doing is tearing up some kitchen foil, and just pushing that into the gaps to fill them up initially, then I'll do the final finishing with the milliput. The good thing about this stuff is that it can be smoothed down with water, so what I'll often do is use some water just to smooth it down initially with a sculpting tool, but I then find it quite useful to come in with a wet paper towel and just smooth it down further with that. I can also now start gluing together some of the detail on the legs as well, so I'm just gluing in place these pistons which attach to the legs. The main body of the mech has lines of bolts, but I need somewhere for these bolts to actually terminate, so what I'm doing is to cut down a dome, which is the same size as the one I used on the main body of the mech. What I'm going to do is just cut out a small curved channel which will go around the top of the mech, and then the lines of bolts that I've made will come up and meet these at the top. So hopefully you can see how that's going to look. So I'm just tacking it in place again just to make sure everything lines up. Now I'm happy with that. I can now glue this in place, glue the lines of bolts in place, which are cast pieces which I made in the previous part of the video. I've drawn some pencil lines down the side of the body just to make sure I get the alignment right on these as well. So now I can add some additional bolts to the curved sections here, and that should hopefully tie everything together and make it look consistent. Now what I also want to do is have some additional detail on the sides of the mech, and I was thinking about doing some additional sculptures. I figured if I did one sculpture I could then just replicate it on the other side, but I thought maybe I've got enough sculptural detail on this robot now, so what I'm actually doing is to make a hatch for the driver to actually get in. One reason I decided to do this was the fact that with a lot of the mechs it's sometimes difficult to tell the scale of the robot, like how big is it actually supposed to be. And because I don't have anything which directly relates to a person, it's not quite clear how big this robot is. Now that's possibly fine, I don't think you necessarily have to do that, but I thought it would be quite nice to actually give a definite sense of scale. And if you put a door in your robot or your tank or whatever it is, then that actually indicates how big a person is in relation to the machine. So I thought that would be quite a nice thing to do. So what I've done is to draw out the shape I need on a separate section of the conduit that I used for the main body for this, and I'm just cutting that out with a Dremel and sanding it down to size. And I'm just adding some additional styrene strips onto this to give some detail. I'm also using part of a plastic press stud. I've got a bunch of these and they really look like wheels or pressure valves, things like that, so they're quite useful. So I think that's going to look quite nice as a sort of locking mechanism. Now what I've also got is some additional acorn nuts, and these are even smaller than the ones I use on the main body of the mech, so I thought these would be quite good to use on the door, and again they sort of just give a sense of scale as well. I'm just trying to work in as much detail into this as I can. I think if you keep things too simplistic, then they don't necessarily look realistic, I don't think. I think you need quite a lot of texture in this sort of stuff, lots of small details, all the sort of stuff you would normally expect to find in this sort of thing. I think once you add a sufficient level of detail in, it starts to look realistic. So I'm just making a small gantry that can go underneath the door. And in order to balance things out, I've also made a separate section of detail on the side of the mech here, and all this is another curved piece of conduit which I've cut out, and then I've kit bashed a few bits onto there, the few remaining parts from the model kit that I used for my first mech several months ago. Now turning my attention to the base, I wanted to add a little bit more detail than I have on the last mech that I did. I thought the base on that one was pretty bare really, so I'm going to try and add some foliage and things like that in there. Before I do any of that, I need to add some wiring in, so I need somewhere to plug a power supply in, and then some wires to go up into the mech so I can supply power. Now you've seen me do this on various other models, so I won't go into too much detail what I'm doing here, but I've added a layer of plaster to sort of give a degree of contouring to the base, and I'm now painting on some PVA glue which I've coloured with some paint. I'm now adding a mix of grout and builder's sand onto the base, and that's going to adhere to the glue. What I'm also doing is spraying it with isopropyl alcohol and then dripping a mix of water and PVA glue over it. The isopropyl alcohol allows the water and PVA glue mix to permeate through the powder, and once that's dry it will hold everything in place. Now I might have added a little bit too much water and glue here, so I've created a bit of a mud bath, but I figured, well, why not? That's not a problem. This is sort of meant to be on a battlefield or something, so there's bound to be mud and puddles and things like that all over the place, so I think that's fine. So now just adding in some sticky blobs of grass and some bits and pieces that I found from the garden. And it's really just a question of slowly building this up and trying to get a natural look. I'm also adding a layer of gloss Mod Podge, which is a type of glue from the US. When that dries, it's going to dry clear, but it's also going to dry with a very glossy finish, so that should look like a wet, sort of a muddy, puddle-like section in the middle. So there we go, there's one base. I did think about adding some clear resin and things like that to it as well, but I decided not to in the end. I think you can keep adding detail and detail and detail, but to be honest with you, I was sort of running out of time for this anyway, so I think that looks pretty good for the time being. So as I mentioned, I do need to now sand and polish the sculpture on the front of the model. I wanted to wait until I had everything glued in place before I did this, but I also needed to do it before I painted the mech. If I start rubbing this with wire wool and sort of getting polishing wheels on it and things like that, if I miss, I run the risk of sanding off the paint that I've added. So I want to get that nice and shiny beforehand, then I can mask it off and come in and paint the rest of the mech. So the wire wool's got off some of the surface layer and is beginning to reveal the metal beneath. And what we've also got is this polishing wheel on the Dremel, so I'm just going over this with that as well to try and bring out a bit more of a shine. Right, so I've got that polished up a little, and what I now need to do is spray paint the rest of the mech. Now what I intend to do is to mask off the sculpture sections, and what I've often used in the past is this stuff called Maskell from Humbrol, but to be honest with you, all it is really latex. So what I've done is to buy a big old bottle of latex, and this should do the trick. So I'm just going to brush this over the front of the sculpture pieces and let it dry, and that will act as a mask. Now the reason I'm doing this rather than masking tape is simply because I've got a lot of curved surfaces on this, on the edge, and I just want to make sure that I can actually accurately follow the curved edge of the sculpture whilst leaving the plastic bare. So a bit easier to do that with a paintbrush than it is with a roll of masking tape. So now that I have those sections masked off, I can now use a spray undercoat to coat the rest of the model. I also need to do the legs as well, so I'm taking these off the base, and I'm also pulling out these metal springs that I've used for cables. I want to retain the original metal finish for those, so I'm just taking those out before I spray paint the legs. Always nice to see a spray painted model, so it really does tie all of the various elements together. So before I start adding the main colour, I'm just going to add a little bit of metallic paint to the edges of the model. As before, what I'm going to do is have a slightly chipped paint effect here, so I'm just going to paint the edges a metallic colour, and then I'm going to use some more of my latex to add a mask to it. So I'm just dabbing that on with a sponge, and that's just going to add a little bit of latex here and there, so once I've overcoated the whole thing, I can scrape that away and reveal the metallic paint beneath. For the leg section, I'm largely going to paint this in metallic colours and then add some rust and dirt to it. I figure this thing's been walking about a muddy landscape, so the legs are likely to be pretty dirty. I should really have painted the feet before I started doing the base. Unfortunately, I was waiting for my paint to arrive in the mail, so I didn't have the chance. So I'm just being quite careful to add a little bit of metallic showing through here and there. I think it should look quite nice. I've also got these inserts which go into the side of the shapes that I've used for the ankles for the feet. So I've just blue tacked these to a strip of plastic, and I'm giving those a coating of metallic paint as well. So now that the inserts are dry, I can just glue those into the feet like this. I mentioned during my previous Mech build that my airbrushes started playing up and that I really needed a new one, so I eventually got around to buying one. Now, I'm not an expert on airbrushes or anything like that. I know Iwata is a fairly well-known brand, and this was fairly reasonably priced on Amazon, so I thought I'd get this and give it a go. So the reviews were good, so I thought, why not? So what I'm doing is mixing up some paint. I'm using Tamiya colours, and I'm just thinning them down with some isopropyl alcohol. So I've got to say there's a real difference between this new airbrush and my cheapo eBay one that I bought several years ago. This works really, really well. The flow is really good. It hasn't got blocked. It doesn't spatter. So yeah, just really, really easy to use. So I'm really happy with this. What I'm doing here is to spray paint this initially with a darker red colour. I'm then going to overlay it with a light red, and hopefully that's going to give me a nice sort of maroon colour with a degree of shading underneath. So I've now given my initial undercoat time to dry, and I'm now coming in with a lighter red to give an overlay over the base colour. So I'm quite pleased with how this has come out. As you can see, there is a degree of variation in the colour. I think that's coming out on camera, and it's certainly coming out much stronger to the eye as well. But I'm quite pleased with that. I don't want this to be a one uniform colour. I want there to be a degree of variation and a degree of shading to it. So I quite like the way that looks. So now that this is dry, I can now come in and scratch away my masking to reveal my metallic colours beneath. Having the cold cast brass against the dark red should hopefully look quite nice. So I'm just peeling away the latex to reveal the metallic colours beneath. So that's looking pretty good. Obviously I've got a bit of tidy up around the edges. And what I'm also going to do is come in with the airbrush again and start adding some black shading around the edge to further try to tie those two pieces together. So I can now turn my attention to weathering up these metal sections. So what I'm doing is to use some weathering powders mixed in with a matte coat and then thinned down with white spirit. So what I can do is put those on and then just let them drip down over the entire model. And they just sort of give a sort of a dirty, rusty, sort of grimy look to the piece. The white spirit doesn't interact with the Tamiya colours that I've used for the metallics, so I can just add these on and drip them over without fear of the two paints interacting and mixing together. I've also been looking at the electronics, and I've fed the two mains wires up into the model, and I've added some LEDs. Now these are LEDs cut from one of those LED strips you can buy. You can cut them into sections of 3 and then just wire them up to a 12 volt supply. So that's quite easy to do, so that's how these are going to look. As with some other models that I've done previously, I want to have some lighting within the model itself. So what I've actually made is these little sort of strip light things, which I'm going to put underneath the mech so that they shine down onto the lights. Adding the grille just gives a little bit of sort of interactive lighting, if you know what I mean, and that it's going to disperse the light in sort of an interesting way. Now, I don't know how this is going to look till I try it, but hopefully it should look quite nice. And as you can see, it is casting a bit of a shadow, so I don't know how apparent that will be, but at least it's doing something interesting. One other detail I wanted to add in is some pneumatic lines going into these pistons. So I've made some sections out of brass tubing and braided cable, and I'm just gluing these onto the pistons. It always bothers me if there's pistons which aren't actually connected to anything, so you know, how do they get their power? What are they powered by? So I always think it's important to add some form of line or some form of indication that there's some machinery going on that will actually drive these things. So there we go, there's the finished robot. I'm quite happy with this one actually. I think this has come out maybe better than my previous one. I think that's really down to the level of detail that I've worked into it. I think maybe the previous mech that I made just didn't have enough detail on it to maybe sell the scale or the overall idea. I do quite like it still, but nevertheless I think I do prefer this one. So I think that's it. If you've made it this far through the video, then thanks very much for watching. This probably won't be the last mech I made. I've already got a variety of other ideas for more, so keep an eye out for that. But for the time being, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. I'll be posting videos on future projects, so if you'd like to keep up with what's going on, please do subscribe. Alternatively, you can visit my website, which is www.thedarkpower.com, or you can find me on Facebook, just search for The Dark Power.